There's a moment I keep thinking about from Season 4, Episode 1, 30 Days Without an Accident. Rick encounters a woman named Clara in the woods outside the prison. She's starving, desperate, begging to join his community with her husband Eddie, and Rick tells her there are 3 questions she has to answer first. But before he can ask them, Clara tries to attack him, then stabs herself. As she's dying, she asks what the questions were. Rick kneels beside her and says, "How many walkers have you killed? How many people have you killed? Why?" Clara answers Eddie killed walkers until he turned. She killed just herself. And you don't get to come back from things. That last answer haunts me. Because what if Rick's 3 questions weren't just about safety? What if they were about something deeper, about who deserves to survive? Who gets to come back from the things they've done? Let's trace that question together. The 3 questions first appeared on screen in Season 4's premiere, and the timing matters. This was months after the prison had become a functioning community. Rick wasn't the sheriff anymore. He'd stepped back from leadership, handed his gun to the council, was farming, and trying to build something peaceful. The group had survived the governor's first assault, had established a council-based governance system, and was actively recruiting new members to strengthen their numbers. But the questions emerged anyway. This protocol for evaluating strangers who wanted to join. And here's what strikes me. The questions weren't Rick's invention alone. Showrunner Scott M. Gimple confirmed on Talking Dead that the prison council had implemented them as standard procedure. Even Daryl has to ask them, Gimple said. It was a collective decision by people who'd learned that trust without verification gets you killed. The council included Rick, Daryl, Glenn, Carol, Sasha, and Herschel people who'd all lost someone to misplaced trust or missed warning signs. But the conceptual origin goes back further than Season 4, back to Season 3, Episode 6, Hounded, when Rick was broken by Lori's death during childbirth. He hallucinates phone calls from dead group members Amy, Jim, Jackie, and finally Lori herself. And those voices ask him variations of the same questions that would later become the protocol. How many people have you killed? Why did you kill them? Could you have done something different? Those phone calls were Rick's guilt and grief made audible, his subconscious interrogating him about the cost of leadership and survival. By Season 4, Rick had externalized that interrogation. He'd turned his own trauma into a vetting system for strangers. The questions he was asking himself in those dark moments after Lori's death became the questions he asked people who wanted to join his community. When Clara attacks Rick and then stabs herself in desperation, she's already dying when she asks what the questions were. Rick recites them almost mechanically. How many walkers have you killed? How many people have you killed? Why? And her answers reveal everything the questions were designed to uncover. Experience. Eddie killed walkers until he turned. Moral weight. She'd only killed herself. And philosophy. You don't get to come back from things. That last part. You don't get to come back from things. That's the hidden truth the questions are trying to expose. Not just what you've done, but whether you can live with it. Whether you've crossed lines you can't uncross. The emotional stake here is profound. Who gets to decide worthiness in a world without laws? Rick and the prison council created a buffer, a first shield against threats. Actor Andrew Lincoln described them as exactly that, a buffer, a first shield, and then it's just a matter of proving yourself. But they also created a judgment system. Answer wrong, and you're turned away. Answer right, and you're still not guaranteed entry. You just get the chance to prove yourself through actions. And here's the pattern I'm seeing from that very first instance with Clara. The questions expose more about the asker than the person answering. Rick is carrying the weight of everyone he's killed, everyone who's died under his leadership. Shane, Lori, T-Dog, Andrea, Merle, Dale, countless others from Woodbury and the road. The questions are his way of externalizing that burden, of asking strangers to justify their violence, so he doesn't have to justify his own quite so loudly. When did survival become about moral judgment? That's the question underneath the questions. And it happened gradually, I think. After the farm fell and they spent winter on the road, starving and desperate. After Rick declared, "This isn't a democracy anymore," and became the leader who made hard calls. After Lori died and Rick broke. After Woodbury and the realization that other humans were more dangerous than walkers. By season 4, survival had become inseparable from moral calculation. Who can we trust? Who deserves our resources? Who's worth the risk? The 3 questions try to answer those calculations through protocol. The third question, why? That's where the real evaluation happens. And I keep thinking about how different that question is from the first 2. The first 2 questions measure observable facts. How many walkers establishes you've faced the threat, that you're not naive about what the world has become, that you understand survival requires violence against the dead. It's a baseline competency check. How many people establishes you've made hard choices, that you understand survival sometimes requires violence against the living, not just the dead. It's acknowledgement that the apocalypse forces impossible moral compromises. But why? Measures something else entirely. It measures whether you can articulate a moral framework under pressure, whether you've thought about the cost of what you've done, whether you justify killing as necessity, defense, revenge, mercy, or something darker. It's asking, do you carry the weight of your choices, or did you make them without conscience? In season 4, episode 4, Indifference, Rick takes Carol on a supply run, and they encounter 2 survivors named Sam and Anna. Rick asks them the 3 questions. They answer satisfactorily. They've killed walkers to survive, killed people in self-defense when attacked by raiders, did what they had to do to keep breathing. Rick allows them to help gather supplies from a neighborhood they're scouting. But later, Anna is killed by walkers while searching a house, and Sam disappears, presumably dead or abandoning his partner. The questions didn't predict their fates. They didn't guarantee safety, competence, or loyalty. They were just a conversation starter, a way to establish that these strangers understood the world they were living in. Back in season 4, episode 13, Alone, we get a flashback to before the prison, when Daryl and Glenn found Bob Stookie wandering alone on a road. The flashback shows them approaching Bob cautiously, weapons ready, and they ask him the 3 questions, just as the council policy dictated. Bob answers honestly. He's killed dozens of walkers, maybe hundreds, lost count after a while. He killed 1 person. When they ask why, Bob pauses, then says, "Because she asked me to." A mercy killing. Someone who was bitten, who didn't want to turn, who begged Bob to end it before the transformation. That answer, "because she asked me to," reveals compassion in the midst of horror. It reveals someone who values autonomy and mercy over survival at any cost. Someone who'll do the hard thing if it's the right thing. And Bob proves loyal until his death. He joins the prison community, becomes part of the family, fights alongside them at Terminus, gets captured by the Terminus cannibals, and reveals he was bitten just before they ate his leg. Tainted meat, he laughs through the horror. Bob dies from the walker bite in Season 5, but his character arc validates the question's assessment. He was exactly who his answers suggested, someone who'd faced horror, made impossible choices, and carried the weight of them with dignity and dark humor. The pattern here, different whys, reveal different moral universes. Some people kill because they had to, some because they were threatened, some because they were asked, some because they wanted to. Each answer sketches the outline of who someone has become in the apocalypse, what lines they've crossed, what they believe about right and wrong in a world where those concepts have become desperately complicated. And here's what I find fascinating. Rick never asks the questions of people he already perceives as threats. The Terminus cannibals, the wolves, the saviors, the whisperers, none of them get the three-question treatment because they've already identified themselves through violence or intent. The questions are for the ambiguous, for the strangers who might be victims or predators, allies or threats disguised as refugees. But what about the third question's weight for Rick himself? If someone asked him, "Why did you kill?" back in Season 4, what would he have said? Because they threatened my family? Because I had to? Because the world demanded it? His answer would have been different in Season 1 versus Season 4 versus Season 8. The why evolves as the person evolves. Rick in Season 1 killed Shane reluctantly, in self-defense, haunted by it. Rick in Season 4 killed the Claimers brutally, ripping out Joe's throat with his teeth to save Carl. Same man, different why, different relationship to violence. The first two questions measure experience and history. The third measures soul. And maybe that's why it's the last question asked, because once you hear someone's why, you know if they can live with what they've done, or if the weight of it is breaking them. You know if they're still human underneath the survival instinct, or if they've become something else entirely. Here's something that took me years to notice, something significant in its absence. Rick's group never asks each other the three questions. Not once, not ever. Carl was never asked. Daryl was never asked, despite joining the group back in Season 1, before the questions existed as protocol. Michonne, Maggie, Glenn, Carol. None of the core family went through the three-question vetting process, at least not on screen. The questions are an outsider test, not an insider evaluation. They create a boundary between us and them, between people who've proven themselves through shared survival and strangers who need to prove they're not threats. It's the formalization of in-group versus out-group dynamics, the moment when Rick's found family became a tribe with membership requirements. Think about who never gets asked. Negan was never asked the questions. He entered Alexandria as an enemy, not a potential ally, back in Season 6. By the time he was imprisoned in Season 8, and later tentatively accepted into the community, the questions would have been meaningless. His actions had already answered them more thoroughly than words ever could. Hundreds of walkers killed, dozens of people killed, including Glenn and Abraham right in front of Rick's group. Why? People are a resource, Negan said. Power, control, building an empire through fear and organized brutality. The questions were designed for ambiguous strangers, not for known enemies seeking redemption. Carl was never asked because he was Rick's son, part of the group from day one, growing up in the apocalypse rather than adapting to it as an adult. His relationship to violence evolved on screen, from the farm where he accidentally contributed to Dale's death, to the prison where he shot a surrendering Woodbury teenager, to Alexandria, where he argued for mercy and hope over his father's caution. Carl never needed to justify his kills to the group because they watched him make every choice, knew every context, understood the boy becoming a man in a world that demanded he become a killer. Judith was never asked. She was born into the group, Rick and Michonne's daughter, biologically Lori and Shane's, but raised by Rick and later Michonne after Rick's departure. And after the time jump in Season 9, after Rick disappeared and she grew up in a world that knew only the apocalypse, Judith inherited many of Rick's traits, his sense of justice, his willingness to use violence to protect others, his moral compass that pointed toward protecting the weak. But there is no evidence she inherited the 3 questions themselves as a protocol. Not the specific words, anyway. She carries Rick's Colt Python revolver, wears Carl's hat, wields a miniature katana like Michonne's. But the questions, those aren't shown as part of her characterization in Seasons 9, 10, or 11. And maybe that's significant. Maybe the questions were specific to Rick's trauma, to the prison council's particular moment in time between the governor's first assault and the second, between learning to trust again after Woodbury and learning to be cautious again after Terminus. They were a tool that worked for a specific purpose in a specific context, then faded as the group's circumstances changed and evolved. The theory seed I'm planting here, the questions create in-group versus out-group dynamics, and those dynamics are both necessary and limiting. Necessary because you can't extend trust to everyone. In a world where Terminus sets traps using signs promising sanctuary, where the wolves attack communities with trucks full of walkers, where the saviors extort and brutalize, some boundary between family and stranger is required for survival, but also limiting because it prevents connections that could enrich the community, because it formalizes suspicion as the default mode of engagement with anyone new. What if the real test is who you trust enough not to ask? The people you'd let into your home, around your children, into your confidence, without demanding they justify their kills first. That's family. That's the found family Rick's group, built through years of shared trauma, impossible choices, and the stubborn refusal to abandon each other, even when survival logic said they should. The questions were for everyone else, for the Claras and Sams and Bobs and Gabriels and Aarons, who needed to prove they understood the world before being allowed into the inner circle. And once they proved it, once they became family through actions and time and sacrifice, the questions stopped mattering. They were the entrance exam, not the ongoing evaluation. Which raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if the questions were less about safety and more about maintaining tribal identity? About creating a formal process that made Rick's group feel organized and rational, instead of just another band of desperate survivors making gut calls about who to trust? Season 5, Episode 2, Strangers, gives us one of the most interesting and ultimately revealing responses to the 3 questions. Rick's group, traumatized and enraged after escaping Terminus where they were nearly cannibalized, encounters Father Gabriel Stokes hiding in his church. Gabriel is clearly terrified, clearly hasn't survived through combat skill or ruthlessness. He's alone, emaciated, his glasses broken and taped together, his priest's collar still somehow clean. Rick immediately becomes suspicious. In the post-Terminus mindset, anyone still alive and alone must have done something terrible to survive. Rick pats Gabriel down roughly, searching for hidden weapons. And then he asks the 3 questions directly, with an edge to his voice that makes it clear wrong answers mean death. How many walkers have you killed? How many people have you killed? Why? Gabriel's answers come quickly, almost rehearsed. Not any. Not any. Because the Lord abhors violence. 0 walkers. 0 people. Because of faith. That answer should have been immediately disqualifying, right? In a world where survival requires violence, where everyone who's still breathing has blood on their hands. Someone who claims 0 kills of any kind seems dangerously naive, catastrophically unprepared, potentially a liability who will get others killed through incompetence or freeze in crisis. Carl, standing nearby, looks at his father like, "Are we really going to accept this?" But Rick lets Gabriel stay anyway, lets the group shelter in the church. Why? Partly because they desperately need the safety and the church is defensible. Partly because Gabriel seems genuinely harmless, even pathetic. And partly, I think, because Rick is testing the questions themselves, pushing against his own paranoia to see if mercy is still possible after Terminus. And here's where it gets complicated, where the questions reveal their fundamental limitation. Gabriel was telling the complete truth. Those were his factually accurate numbers at that moment. 0 walkers killed, 0 people killed, faith as his reason for avoiding violence. But the questions didn't reveal what actually mattered, that Gabriel had locked his congregation out of his church to be devoured by walkers at the outbreak's beginning. That trauma, that guilt, that moral failure wasn't uncovered by how many or why. It came out later in the next episode, when Sasha noticed a message scratched into the church exterior. "You'll burn for this." When confronted, Gabriel confesses everything through sobs, the screaming, the pounding on the doors, his cowardice, his survival purchased with the deaths of everyone who trusted him. The pattern here, the questions can be answered truthfully and still hide the most important truths. Gabriel didn't lie to Rick. He gave accurate numbers and an accurate philosophical framework. But he didn't reveal himself, didn't expose the thing that defined his character more than any kill count could. The protocol failed to uncover what mattered most. Or maybe, and this is where I start questioning the questions themselves, maybe they worked exactly as intended. Maybe they were never meant to be a perfect filter, just a starting point for evaluation, a way to get strangers talking, to hear their voice and cadence, to watch their body language, to create an opening for the truth to emerge later through observation and interaction. Gabriel's 0 kill answer got him in the door, and then his actions and the evidence around him revealed his true character over time. And Gabriel's arc is actually fascinating because it validates this reading. He goes from that 0-0 faith answer in Season 5 to becoming one of Alexandria's fiercest fighters by Season 11. He learns to kill walkers, learns to kill people who threaten his community. He becomes a warrior priest, someone who reconciles faith with violence, who protects his flock with both prayer and guns. The person who answered the questions in Season 5 wouldn't recognize the person Gabriel became, someone who'd execute Maze in Season 10 for playing psychological games, who'd lead brutal missions against the Reapers, who'd stand alongside Rick and Daryl and Michonne as an equal in combat and strategy. So here's my question. If the questions predict anything, what do they actually predict? Not loyalty. Gabriel proved intensely loyal despite his initial moral failure. Not survival ability. His 0 kill answer suggested incompetence, but he survived longer than most. Not moral character. His answers hid his greatest shame. What, then? Maybe nothing. Maybe the questions don't predict at all. Maybe they just provide a framework for the conversation that actually matters, the ongoing one, where you figure out through time and crisis whether this stranger becomes family or threat. By Season 5, Episode 11, The Distance, the questions have become more established as protocol, more routine. And this episode gives us one of the clearest examples of how they function in practice and how they fail to generate trust, even when answered honestly. Aaron appears near Rick's group in a barn where they're sheltering, claiming he's been watching them, following them. He brings photographs of Alexandria, this walled community with houses and electricity and safety. He offers them sanctuary, membership, a chance to stop running. And Rick, paranoid after Terminus, after the road, after constant betrayal and violence, immediately assumes it's a trap, that no offer of safety can be genuine, that anyone offering help wants something terrible in return. So someone needs to ask the questions. But here's what's interesting and easily forgotten. It's Michonne who asks them, not Rick. Rick is too deep in his paranoia, too convinced Aaron is leading them into another Terminus-style trap. He won't even engage with the possibility of accepting Aaron's offer. So Michonne, who's been advocating for Washington, D.C., for the possibility that Eugene's cure mission meant something, for the idea that they need to stop just surviving and start living, Michonne steps up. She asks Aaron directly, "How many walkers have you killed? How many people have you killed? Why?" Aaron answers honestly and immediately. "Too many walkers to count. It's just survival routine at this point. 2 people. Because they tried to kill me. Self-defense when raiders attacked Alexandria's scouting parties." His answers are exactly what the questions are designed to elicit: competence, moral restraint, clear ethical boundaries around violence. But the moment is immediately complicated. Right after Aaron answers, the group discovers a listening device hidden in his car. Then they're attacked by a walker herd during the drive to Alexandria. Then Rick's paranoia intensifies, and he insists on approaching Alexandria at night, weapons ready, prepared for betrayal. Aaron's honest answers to the questions didn't earn trust. They earned the bare minimum a chance to prove himself through actions. And that proof comes slowly. Aaron introducing them to Deanna Monroe. The video interviews where Alexandria's leader vets the group. Aaron standing beside them when Alexandria's original residents doubt them, fear them, want them expelled for being too violent and dangerous. Aaron recruiting Daryl specifically, seeing something in him that needed purpose and belonging. Aaron becoming family not through answering questions, but through months of demonstrated loyalty and shared struggle. The pattern emerging. The questions open a door, but they don't determine what walks through it. Trust is built through actions, not answers. Words are cheap in the apocalypse. Everyone can claim self-defense, claim necessity, claim they only killed when forced. What matters is what you do when the crisis comes, who you protect, who you sacrifice, what lines you won't cross even when crossing them would be easier. And there's another instance worth examining in detail. Season 6, Episode 10, The Next World. Jesus Paul Rovia from the hilltop appears, stealing supplies from Alexandria, evading capture with acrobatic skill and infuriating humor. Rick and Daryl chase him, catch him, lose him, catch him again. At one point, Rick starts to ask the 3 questions. How many? And Jesus literally runs away before they can be completed. He escapes, reappears later tied up in their truck, escapes again through impossible flexibility and timing. Jesus never answers the questions, never goes through the formal vetting, and yet he becomes one of Alexandria's most trusted allies, the bridge between communities, the person who introduces them to Hilltop and Ezekiel, and eventually the coalition that fights the saviors. He proves himself through actions bringing Rick to Hilltop, facilitating trade, fighting alongside them, dying in Season 9, to protect others from whisperers. So we have Gabriel, who answered truthfully but hid the truth. We have Aaron, who answered honestly and was still distrusted. We have Jesus, who never answered at all and became family anyway. The question's predictive power starts to look extremely weak when you examine actual outcomes. They don't predict loyalty, competence, or character. They don't generate trust or prevent betrayal. They're a ritual, a performance, a way for Rick's group to feel like they have some control over the chaos of strangers in a lawless world. And maybe that psychological function mattered more than any practical one. Maybe the questions gave the prison council, and later Alexandria's leadership, a framework for dealing with strangers that felt deliberate and measured rather than impulsive and fearful. Even if the answers didn't really matter, asking them did. The ritual created a sense of order. Season 11 brings us to the Commonwealth, and with it, a parallel system that makes Rick's 3 questions look almost quaint by comparison. When Eugene, Yumiko, Princess, and Ezekiel arrive at this 50,000-person community, the largest settlement we've seen in the entire Walking Dead universe, they're processed through an intensive auditor system. Forms, background checks, questions about pre-apocalypse employment, education credentials, criminal history, skills, and certifications. The Commonwealth asks, what was your job before? What degrees did you earn? What was your socio-economic status? They're evaluating who people were in the old world, assigning new world roles based on old world hierarchies. Eugene, with his claimed credentials as a scientist, gets assigned to work in education and research. Yumiko, an attorney before, gets fast-tracked toward legal and governance roles. Princess, who had nothing before, gets assigned menial labor. Ezekiel, a zookeeper before and a king after, gets assigned sanitation work because that's what his resume says he's qualified for. The contrast is deliberate and thematically rich. Rick's questions ask, what have you done to survive? The Commonwealth asks, what were you qualified to do before survival mattered? Rick's system evaluates present character and recent choices. The Commonwealth system assigns permanent class positions based on past credentials that may be irrelevant or fabricated. And both systems are flawed in revealing ways. Rick's questions can be lied to, can miss crucial character flaws like Gabriel's lockout, can't predict loyalty or competence. The Commonwealth system recreates old-world inequality, traps people in roles determined by credentials that stopped mattering when the world ended, refuses to acknowledge that the apocalypse might have changed who someone is and what they're capable of. But here's what's significant. Alexandria, even after Rick's disappearance, maintains some form of stranger evaluation. We don't see the exact 3-question formula used on screen after Season 6, but the principle remains visible in how the community treats newcomers. There's caution, observation, a probationary period where strangers prove themselves before being fully integrated. The specific questions may have faded, but the framework of evaluation persisted. Different communities, different standards. The Hilltop, under Maggie's leadership, likely had its own vetting procedures, shaped by her experiences with the Saviors and Whisperers. Oceanside, under Cindy's leadership, certainly did. They had a policy of killing every man who washed ashore for years, executing potential threats based on gender alone, until Aaron convinced them to join the coalition against the Saviors. The Kingdom, under Ezekiel's leadership, was more theatrical, but still cautious, requiring strangers to demonstrate value and loyalty before being trusted. Communities define themselves by what they ask strangers, what they prioritize in evaluation, what they're willing to forgive, and what they consider unforgivable. Rick's 3 questions prioritized survival competence. Can you kill walkers? Moral awareness. Have you killed people? And philosophical framework. Why did you do it? That tells you what Alexandria valued under Rick's influence, strength, honesty about violence, and the ability to articulate a moral framework even in a world without laws or consequences. The Commonwealth prioritizes credentials, pre-apocalypse status, and social hierarchy. That tells you what they value: order, familiarity, the comfort of recreating the old world, even when that world's systems directly contributed to the collapse. They want to pretend the apocalypse didn't fundamentally change humanity's relationship to power, labor, and worth. And maybe both are right in their own way. Maybe both are catastrophically wrong. Maybe there's no perfect system for evaluating strangers when everyone has trauma, everyone has killed, everyone has done things they regret to survive another day. Rick's questions try to measure moral character through violence, which seems almost contradictory, judging someone's soul by their body count. The Commonwealth tries to measure worth through credentials, which ignores that a zookeeper might become a brilliant leader and a corporate executive might be completely useless at actual survival. What we're really seeing is different communities trying to solve the same impossible problem. How do you build trust with strangers when trust gets you killed? How do you grow your community without letting in the people who'll destroy it from within? How do you stay human and compassionate while also staying safe and vigilant? Rick's 3 questions were one attempted answer. The Commonwealth's auditor system is another. Neither works perfectly. Neither prevents betrayal or guarantees loyalty. Both create their own problems. Rick's questions can be lied to. The Commonwealth system creates permanent underclasses and resentment. Maybe the real answer is that there is no system, no set of questions or credentials or evaluations that can predict human behavior in impossible circumstances. Maybe community is always a gamble, trust is always a risk, and survival requires accepting that sometimes you'll be wrong about people in both directions. Sometimes the person you trusted will betray you, and sometimes the person you rejected could have saved you. Eugene's story and Gabriel's story get conflated constantly in fan discussions of the 3 questions, creating a narrative that doesn't actually match what happened on screen. So let's separate them carefully and see what the actual canon tells us about truth, lies, and the question's ability to expose either. Eugene was never shown being asked Rick's 3 questions on screen. He joined the group through traveling with Abraham and Rosita in Season 4, already embedded in their mission to get him to Washington, D.C., where he claimed to be a government scientist with crucial information about the outbreak. By the time Eugene, Abraham, and Rosita joined Rick's larger group, Eugene was already vouched for by Abraham, already part of a unit that had proven itself in combat. The formal vetting process didn't apply because he came with references, essentially. Eugene's famous lie, claiming to know what caused the outbreak, claiming to have a cure, claiming government credentials and scientific expertise he didn't possess that lie, was exposed in Season 5. Episode 5, Self-Help, when he finally admits he's not a scientist, doesn't know anything, and fabricated the entire mission because he knew Abraham and Rosita wouldn't protect him otherwise. It was survival through deception, using other people's hope as a weapon to ensure his own safety. But that has nothing to do with the 3-question protocol. Eugene lied about his credentials and mission, but he was never asked how many walkers he'd killed. Answer: very few. He's not a fighter. How many people he'd killed? Answer: at least 1 by Season 11. More by necessity than choice. Or why? Answer: because he had to. Because survival demanded it. The questions and Eugene's lies exist in completely separate narrative spaces. Now, Gabriel. As we discussed earlier, Gabriel was asked the questions in Season 5, Episode 2, and answered truthfully. 0 walkers, 0 people, because the Lord abhors violence. Those were his factually accurate numbers at that moment. But he hid a deeper truth that he'd locked his congregation outside his church to be devoured at the outbreak's beginning. That cowardice, that abandonment, that moral failure came out through a different mechanism entirely. Sasha noticed the scratched message on the church exterior. Rick confronted him. Gabriel confessed through tears about the screaming and pounding on the doors, about choosing his own survival over the people who trusted him as their shepherd. So Gabriel didn't lie to the questions. He just didn't volunteer information they didn't specifically ask for. The questions asked about kills, and Gabriel hadn't killed anyone directly. Locking people out to die isn't the same as killing them yourself, at least not in the technical sense the questions measure. It's a moral distinction without much difference, but it's how Gabriel could answer honestly while still hiding his greatest shame. The pattern some fans see, lying to evaluation questions, predicts eventual betrayal or the need for redemption. Eugene betrayed the group's trust with his cure lie, then spent seasons earning back credibility through his actual skills in manufacturing and engineering. Gabriel hid his lockout trauma, then spent seasons earning redemption through transformation from coward to warrior. But that pattern doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Gabriel didn't lie, he answered accurately and incompletely. And his redemption arc isn't about the questions at all. It's about him learning to value the living more than his guilt about the dead, learning that faith without action is meaningless, learning that protecting your community sometimes requires violence, that God may or may not forgive, but that necessity demands anyway. Aaron, asked by Michonne in Season 5, answered honestly about his 2 kills in self-defense and became one of Alexandria's most loyal members. Jesus never asked at all because he ran away, became equally loyal and trusted. The correlation between honesty in answering and later loyalty doesn't exist. The correlation between dishonesty and betrayal doesn't exist either. Eugene's lies were never tested by the questions, and Gabriel's honesty coexisted with hidden trauma. What the questions actually do is create a moment of vulnerability. A conversation where strangers have to talk about killing, have to acknowledge the weight of survival, have to admit they've crossed moral lines they never imagined crossing before the world ended. Whether they answer honestly or not, whether they reveal everything or hide crucial details, the act of asking creates an opportunity for observation. Rick, watching eyes and body language. Michonne assessing tone and hesitation. Daryl reading micro-expressions from years of tracking and hunting. The questions aren't a lie detector. They're a conversation starter that gives trained observers data about who this stranger might be. And sometimes that data is useful. Sometimes it's misleading. Sometimes it doesn't matter at all, because trust or distrust will be determined by later actions, regardless of initial answers. Can you join a family built on shared trauma if you won't acknowledge your own? That's the real question the protocol is testing. Not, did you kill, but can you talk about killing? Not, are you dangerous, but do you understand that we're all dangerous now? And the question is whether your danger points outward at threats or inward at us. Here's something that struck me while rewatching the entire series. Rick's 3 questions never ask about hope, creation, or contribution. They focus entirely on violence and death. Walkers killed, people killed, reasons for killing. They measure destruction, not construction. Experience with taking life, not preserving it. The questions Rick asks strangers are fundamentally different from questions someone like Herschel would have asked. And that difference reveals worldviews, philosophies, entire frameworks for understanding what survival means and what it costs. Imagine if Herschel had designed the vetting protocol for the prison. What would he have asked? Probably, are you hurt? Do you need medicine? Can you work? Are you willing to contribute to farming, building, protecting? Herschel believed in healing, in preserving life even at a personal cost, in maintaining humanity and dignity even when survival seemed to demand otherwise. He kept walkers in the barn on the farm thinking they were sick people who could potentially be cured. He tried to convince Rick in Season 3 that farming mattered more than fighting, that growing food and building infrastructure created more security than stockpiling weapons. Herschel would have asked about what someone could create, not what they destroyed. About their willingness to help others, not their efficiency at killing threats. About their capacity for compassion, not their body count. But Herschel died, brutally, senselessly, executed by the governor with Michonne's own katana in Season 4, Episode 8, Too Far Gone. He died believing that mercy and wisdom mattered more than strength. That negotiation was worth trying even with monsters like the governor. And his death seemed to validate Rick's harsher worldview, that Herschel's approach, generous and hopeful and focused on healing rather than threat assessment, that approach gets you killed in the world. The Walking Dead depicts. Rick survived. Rick's questions became the protocol. And that tells us something uncomfortable about which philosophy the apocalypse rewards. Not Herschel's wisdom and compassion, but Rick's caution and violence. Not who can we help, but who might hurt us. The questions reveal Rick's trauma-shaped worldview. They focus on what we've destroyed because Rick is haunted by everyone and everything he's destroyed. Shane, Lori, the Woodbury soldiers, his own innocence and hope. They measure violence because Rick has become someone defined by violence, even when he tries to step back from it into farming and council governance. The questions are Rick asking himself, how much blood is on my hands? Was it necessary? Can I live with it? And then projecting that interrogation onto strangers as a vetting mechanism. Contrast this with what the questions don't ask. They never ask, who have you saved? They never ask, what have you built? They never ask, what would you die to protect? Those questions would measure hope, creation, values, the things that make survival worth the cost. But Rick doesn't ask them because by Season 4, Rick doesn't believe those things can be measured or trusted. Anyone can claim to value family, claim to protect the weak, claim to build rather than destroy. But kill counts and reasons for killing those reveal something harder to fake. Or do they? Gabriel claimed 0 kills and hid his congregation's abandonment. Eugene would have claimed kills in self-defense and hidden his complete fabrication of credentials and purpose. The questions measure violence, but violence is the easiest thing to lie about because verification is impossible. Who's going to fact-check your body count in the apocalypse? Maybe the hidden test isn't the answers, but what we choose to measure in the first place. By asking about kills instead of saves, about death instead of life, about destruction instead of creation, Rick reveals that his priority is threat assessment over everything else, safety through vigilance, survival through being harder, colder, more willing to do violence than the people who might hurt you. And it works. Alexandria survives under Rick's leadership. The community makes it through the wolves, the saviors, the whisperers, and into the Commonwealth era. Rick's approach keeps people alive. But at what cost? How many potential allies were turned away because their answers seemed wrong? How many connections were never made because the first conversation was about killing rather than healing, about violence rather than hope? Herschel's approach got him killed. Rick's approach kept him alive until he chose to sacrifice himself to save everyone by destroying the bridge in Season 9. Both men believed their approach was right. Both paid terrible prices. Both left legacies that shaped their communities long after they were gone. The questions focus on violence and death because that's what shaped Rick. Not because it's the only thing worth measuring, but because it's what he learned to measure through years of trauma. And maybe that's the saddest thing about the three questions. They work well enough to be adopted as protocol, but they reflect a worldview born from loss rather than hope, from fear rather than trust, from the belief that the best predictor of future behavior is past violence. Maybe the hidden test is what we choose to measure. And maybe Rick measured violence because violence was what remained after everything else was taken from him. Let me share the core theory that's been forming. The third question, why, isn't actually about the content of the answer. It's about the hesitation before answering, about whether someone has thought deeply about their kills or just done them and moved on without reflection, about self-awareness versus survival instinct. Think about how Rick asks the questions. He doesn't just listen to words. He watches eyes, body language, micro-expressions, the pause before speaking. When Clara answers, "You don't get to come back from things," there's profound weight in her voice, resignation, acceptance of permanent moral damage. When Gabriel answers, "Because the Lord abhors violence," there's certainty, but also something evasive underneath, a too-quick answer that feels rehearsed. When Aaron answers, "Because they tried to kill me," there's directness, no shame or hesitation, just factual accounting of self-defense. The pattern. Those who answer quickly might have rehearsed responses, might be telling you what they think you want to hear, rather than what's true. Those who answer slowly, who have to think about it, who struggle to articulate why, those are the people who've actually grappled with the moral weight of killing. They carry it as a burden, rather than just a survival statistic. Why isn't looking for a specific correct answer. Self-defense, protection of family, mercy, killing, necessity. All of these are acceptable within the framework the questions create. What, why, is actually measuring is whether you can articulate a moral framework under pressure, whether you've thought about the cost of what you've done, whether you understand that killing people, even in self-defense, even when necessary, even in the apocalypse that it changes you, costs something, should weigh on your conscience. Some people kill and move on. They don't think about it, don't carry it, don't let it burden them. They're efficient survivors, maybe, but they're also potentially dangerous because violence without moral weight can escalate without limit. No internal brake on what they're willing to do. Other people kill and it haunts them. They remember faces, circumstances, the moment of decision. They question whether it was truly necessary, whether they could have done something different, whether they're still good people despite the blood on their hands. These people carry weight, and that weight is both burden and protection. A burden because it hurts, protection because it means they won't kill casually, won't become monsters. The third question is trying to distinguish between these types, and the answer matters less than the delivery. Here's where it connects to Rick's own psychology. The questions he asks strangers are questions he's been asking himself since Season 3. The phone call hallucinations after Lori's death, Amy, Jim, Jackie, Lori herself, they all asked Rick variations of the same questions. How many have you killed? Why did you kill them? Could you have done something different? Are you still the good man Lori believed you were? Rick's trauma became externalized into a vetting system. He's asking strangers to answer the questions that haunt him, to justify their violence the way he desperately needs to justify his own. Every time someone answers, "I had to," or "self-defense," or "to protect my family," Rick hears his own rationalizations validated. Every time he accepts someone despite their kill count, he's accepting himself despite his own. This is survivor's guilt transformed into community policy. Rick carries the weight of everyone who died under his leadership. Shane, Lori, T-Dog, Andrea, Axel, Oscar, Merle, Herschel, and so many more. He carries guilt about the prisoners he killed at the prison, the Woodbury soldiers at the satellite station, the claimers he brutally executed to save Carl. The questions externalize that guilt, make it something measurable and communicable instead of just an internal horror. Why did they die? Becomes, why did you kill? The question Rick asks himself transforms into the question he asks strangers. His trauma becomes the entry exam for joining his community. And maybe there's healing in that, strangely. Every person who answers and is accepted represents Rick accepting his own violence, his own choices, his own survival, despite the cost. Every conversation about killing is Rick processing his own kills through proxy. The stranger's burden becomes visible proof that Rick isn't alone in carrying this weight, that everyone who survived has done terrible things, that moral contamination is the universal price of breathing past the outbreak's first days. Are we vetting strangers or healing ourselves? Both, maybe. The questions serve a practical security function. They start conversations that might reveal threats. But they also serve a psychological function for Rick. They create a framework where violence can be discussed, rationalized, accepted without judgment, because judgment would condemn everyone, including himself. The questions measure self-awareness through hesitation. And self-awareness is what separates survivors from monsters, or at least what Rick hopes separates them. What he desperately needs to believe still matters, even in a world where morality seems like a luxury nobody can afford. By season 8, Rick had lost even more. Carl's death, in particular, shattered something fundamental in his worldview. Carl died from a walker bite he received while helping Siddiq, a stranger, showing him that mercy and hope could still matter despite the danger. Carl's death was directly caused by the kind of generosity and trust that Rick's 3 questions were designed to prevent. Help the wrong stranger, and they get you killed. Except Carl didn't see it that way. Carl's letters to Rick, to Negan, to the people he loved, they argued for something more than survival. There's got to be something after, Carl wrote. Something beyond just staying alive, beyond kill counts and threat assessments and walls to keep strangers out. Carl died believing that becoming hard and closed and suspicious wasn't survival but surrender. That you had to risk connection to have anything worth living for. And after Carl's death, Rick stopped asking the questions. They disappear from the show after season 6 anyway, but their disappearance becomes thematically meaningful in light of Carl's philosophy. The questions represented Rick's trauma-based approach to community. Measure violence, vet through interrogation, trust only after extensive proof. Carl represented a different approach. Trust first. Help those who need it. Believe that most people are worth saving, even at personal cost. Carl's way got him killed. But it also got Siddiq integrated into the community, where Siddiq became Alexandria's doctor and saved countless lives over the next seasons. Carl's mercy had a cost, but it also had value that Rick's questions could never measure. The theory I'm building. Maybe the questions were Rick's way of forgiving himself through accepting others. Every time someone answered, "I had to," or self-defense, or because they threatened what I love, Rick heard his own justifications reflected back. Every time he accepted someone despite their kill count, he was accepting himself despite Shane, despite the prison murders, despite becoming someone who could bite out a man's throat to save his son. But Carl's death broke that framework. Because Carl died doing something the questions would have prevented helping a stranger without vetting, without interrogation, without measuring their violence first. And Carl's death seemed to validate the questions, seemed to prove Rick was right to be suspicious and cautious and closed. Except it didn't. Because Carl's final message was that Rick was wrong. That survival alone isn't enough. That there has to be something after the violence, after the fear, after the walls and the questions and the endless vigilance. Something that makes survival worth the cost. So Rick stopped asking. He tried, in the time Carl had left, to build what Carl wanted. Peace with the saviors, cooperation instead of endless war, a future where communities work together instead of destroying each other. Rick failed at that immediately, went back to war, defeated Negan. But he spared Negan's life in the end, honored Carl's vision of mercy even when every instinct screamed for revenge. The questions faded because Rick was evolving, because Carl had shown him that the framework he'd built, measure violence, justify kills, accept only those who understand the moral cost, that framework was too narrow. Too focused on death when life was what mattered. Too focused on what people had destroyed when what they might create was more important. Or maybe the questions just stopped being relevant as the world changed, as communities grew larger and more established, as the initial desperate survival phase gave way to something more stable, as the threats evolved from random strangers who might be cannibals to organized groups like the Saviors and Whisperers who identify themselves through actions rather than answers. Either way, the questions disappeared. Rick never asked them again after Season 6, and when Rick himself disappeared in Season 9, blown up on a bridge trying to save everyone by destroying the Walker herd, the questions didn't come back. Alexandria continued vetting strangers somehow, but not through Rick's protocol, not through those 3 questions born from his specific trauma and guilt. Maybe that's the hidden 4th question, not asked aloud, but implied in every interaction, in every acceptance or rejection. Will you become us? Will you become family? And maybe Rick learned, too late, that the answer to that question can't be found through interrogation about violence. It can only be found through time, through crisis, through the slow building of trust that comes from fighting together, grieving together, surviving together. The questions try to shortcut that process. They try to measure in minutes what should take months. And they failed, mostly, at that impossible task. But maybe they succeeded at something else, at giving Rick a language for his grief, a framework for his guilt, a way to keep going despite carrying unbearable weight. Here's my theory about what the questions were really testing, the unasked 4th question that lurked beneath the other 3. Will you become us? Can you transform from stranger to ally to family? Every person who passed the 3 questions and joined Alexandria was expected to integrate fully, to adopt the community's values, follow its laws, fight its battles, become family rather than just a resident or ally of convenience. The questions weren't just about vetting for threats. They were screening for people who could be transformed, who had the capacity to let go of who they were as a solitary survivor and become part of something larger. And the evidence supports this reading. Gabriel answered the questions, joined the community, and transformed from a coward who'd abandoned his congregation into a warrior priest who'd kill to protect his new flock. Aaron answered via Michonne and became one of Alexandria's key defenders, recruiters, and eventually leaders. Bob answered via Daryl and Glenn and proved loyal until his death, becoming family despite joining late. The pattern. Everyone who passed the questions and stayed eventually became part of the found family. Not just residents, but people who'd die to protect each other, who'd make impossible sacrifices, who'd choose the group's survival over their own comfort or safety. The questions were the first filter for people who had that capacity. But here's where the theory gets more speculative. What about the next generation? Judith grew up after Rick disappeared. She carries his Colt Python, wears Carl's hat, embodies the legacy of protection and justice that Rick and Carl represented. She's a natural leader, a skilled fighter, someone the community looks to despite her youth. But there's no evidence Judith uses the 3 questions themselves. No scenes of her interrogating strangers. No dialogue referencing the protocol. No suggestion that she's carrying forward that specific tradition. Instead, Judith seems to evaluate people through action and instinct. She saves Daryl when he's wounded. She shoots people who threaten Alexandrians. She makes decisions about worthiness through observation rather than interrogation. Maybe that's wisdom, knowing when to stop measuring. The questions created a false sense of control, a belief that you could predict behavior through answers, when really only time and crisis reveal character. Judith, raised in the apocalypse rather than traumatized by its sudden arrival, doesn't need that illusion of control. She trusts her instincts, learns through observation, accepts that community is always a gamble. The next generation might transcend the questions entirely. They might find new ways to evaluate strangers that aren't rooted in Rick's specific trauma about violence and guilt. And maybe that's growth, evolution, hope. Maybe that's what Carl wanted when he wrote about Something After. Not just survival, but a new way of surviving that isn't built entirely on fear and suspicion. Future communities in the spin-offs show divergent approaches. Maggie in Dead City doesn't ask questions, she judges through immediate action, through whether someone can be trusted in crisis, through pragmatic cooperation even with people she despises, like Negan. Daryl in Friends trusts instinct, observation, years of reading people through body language and micro-expressions rather than verbal responses to standardized questions. Both of them knew Rick, lived under his leadership, saw the questions used, and both abandoned that approach in favor of their own methods. Not because Rick was wrong exactly, but because what worked for Rick in his specific trauma and context doesn't necessarily work for others in different circumstances. The questions might have been a necessary tool for their specific moment, the prison council, trying to grow their community while staying safe from Terminus-style threats. But they weren't universal truth, weren't the only way or even necessarily the best way to build community in the apocalypse. Maybe wisdom is knowing when to stop measuring and just start trusting, when to accept that no protocol can eliminate risk, that community requires vulnerability, that found family forms through shared experience rather than through vetting procedures designed by traumatized leaders trying to rationalize violence. The hidden 4th question, will you become us, can't be answered in a single conversation. It can only be answered through time, through choosing to stay when leaving would be easier, through fighting for people who aren't blood but might as well be. And maybe Judith understands that instinctively because She was raised in that found family, watched it form around her, learned that what binds people isn't similar answers to questions about violence, but similar willingness to sacrifice for each other. The questions try to predict that willingness. Judith doesn't bother predicting. She just watches for it, responds to it when it appears, and trusts that genuine people reveal themselves through actions given enough time. Let's talk honestly about what the 3 questions cost. Not just what they prevented, which threats they kept out, which dangers they helped a community avoid, but what they might have lost. How many potential allies were turned away because their answers seemed wrong? How many connections were never made because the first conversation was about killing rather than healing? How many people who could have strengthened Alexandria were rejected because Rick's paranoia after Terminus made him unwilling to risk any stranger at all? We'll never know the answer because the people who fail the test don't appear in the narrative. They walk away, or they're turned away, and we never see them again. They become invisible casualties of the vetting process, filtered out before they could prove themselves through actions. The questions create an unseen selection effect that might have protected Alexandria from catastrophic threats or might have isolated them from crucial help. The moral question here is stark. Do the questions prioritize safety over compassion? Absolutely yes. They're designed from the ground up to keep threats out, not to welcome refugees in. They assume stranger equals potential danger until proven otherwise through extensive vetting. They create a community built on suspicion rather than trust, on caution rather than generosity, on the belief that most people are potential threats rather than potential family. Contrast that with Father Gabriel's approach before Rick's group arrived. Gabriel kept his church doors locked, let nobody in, survived alone through isolation and absolute refusal to risk helping anyone. That approach kept him alive, but also killed his congregation and nearly destroyed his soul. He was safe, but completely alone, breathing, but not really living. But Rick's approach, constant vigilance, threat assessment, questions designed to expose danger before allowing entry, that approach also has costs. It kept Alexandria relatively safe, but also kept it small, cautious, always somewhat closed to outsiders. Even when Alexandria had food and medicine and safety to share, the first response to strangers was interrogation about their violence. That's not exactly a welcoming posture, not exactly the kind of generosity that builds large cooperative networks. There's a third way that Herschel represented before his death: open doors, generous hospitality, belief that most people are fundamentally good and worth saving even at personal risk. Herschel took Rick's group in at the farm despite the danger, shared his resources, offered medical care. He kept walkers in his barn thinking they were sick people who might be cured. He believed in healing over fighting, in preserving humanity over preserving just biological survival. But Herschel died. The farm was overrun. His generous philosophy didn't survive contact with the governor's brutality, didn't protect him from execution, didn't save his daughters from trauma and loss. Herschel's way was beautiful and doomed. So maybe the 3 questions were a necessary compromise, a middle path between Gabriel's fearful isolation and Herschel's generous vulnerability. Maybe in a world where Terminus exists, where communities literally use signs promising sanctuary to lure people into cannibalistic traps, maybe you need some kind of vetting system. Maybe the cost of compassion without caution is extinction, and the questions were simply the price of survival. Or maybe that's just what Rick believed, and his belief became Alexandria's policy, and nobody effectively challenged it until Carl's death forced a reckoning. Carl died helping a stranger, without vetting him first, and Rick had to choose whether to see that as validation of the question's necessity or as indictment of his entire cautious worldview. Rick chose, eventually, to see it Carl's way, to believe that something mattered more than safety, that survival alone wasn't enough, that the walls and questions and endless vigilance created a kind of living death that defeated the point of surviving at all. Would Herschel have asked the 3 questions? Absolutely not. Herschel would have asked, "Are you hurt? Do you need medicine? Can you work?" He would have evaluated strangers based on their need and their willingness to contribute, not on their capacity for violence. But would Herschel's approach have kept Alexandria standing through the wolves, the saviors, the whisperers, and into the Commonwealth era? Almost certainly not. His farm barely survived 1 season before being overrun. His generous philosophy got him and many others killed. The questions represent a worldview shaped by trauma, where safety requires suspicion and compassion is a luxury you can't afford. That worldview kept people alive, but it also created communities that survive without necessarily thriving, that continue breathing without necessarily living, that maintain safety at the cost of connection. Communities built on suspicion might be sustainable, but they're also isolated, slow-growing, resistant to change. They survive, but do they create anything worth surviving for? That's the cost the questions never measured. Not just who was kept out, but what kind of community was built by always asking about violence first and hope never. The spin-offs that came after Rick's departure show us what happens when his approach to strangers has evolved or been completely abandoned. And it's revealing that none of the spin-offs we've seen, Dead City, Daryl Dixon, The Ones Who Live, feature anyone using Rick's 3 questions or anything resembling that protocol. Maggie in Dead City doesn't ask 3 questions. She judges Negan and everyone else through immediate action, through whether someone can be trusted in crisis, through pragmatic cooperation even with people she fundamentally hates. She works with Negan to rescue her son Herschel, not because Negan answered questions satisfactorily or because he's been formally vetted as safe, but because she needs his specific skills and knowledge to navigate Manhattan's post-apocalyptic wasteland. Trust isn't earned through interrogation. It's built, moment by moment, through demonstrated reliability under pressure. Daryl in Friends trusts instinct and observation. He always did, even back when he was asking Bob those 3 questions in the Season 4 flashback. Daryl was never fully comfortable with Rick's structured approach anyway. He was following protocol because the council said to, not because he believed written interrogations revealed character better than watching how someone moved, how they fought, what they did when they thought nobody was looking. Daryl's method has always been observation over conversation, demonstrated competence over verbal justification. And this is the pattern I'm seeing. Rick's 3 questions were specific to his trauma, his guilt about Shane and Lori and everyone else, his need to rationalize violence through a moral framework that made it bearable. The questions worked for Rick during a specific period in Alexandria's development, but they weren't universal truth, weren't the only way to evaluate strangers, weren't even necessarily the best way. The next generation, Judith, RJ, Herschel Reed Jr., the children raised entirely in the apocalypse without memory of the world before they're building something different. They don't have nostalgia for old world systems or protocols. They didn't create vetting procedures based on their grief about the collapse. They're figuring out trust and community through their own experiences, their own frameworks, their own understanding of what humanity means when the old definition died with the old world. And maybe that's hope. Maybe each generation has to find its own way, its own balance between caution and compassion, its own answer to the fundamental question, who deserves to survive, and who gets to decide? Rick asked, "How many walkers have you killed? How many people have you killed? Why?" Those questions revealed a man carrying unbearable weight, trying to create order from chaos, trying to make sense of senseless violence by measuring it, categorizing it, finding moral frameworks that made it bearable. But maybe Judith will ask different questions entirely when she leads. Maybe she'll ask, "What do you need?" Or, "What can you contribute?" Or, "Will you protect people who can't protect themselves?" Maybe her questions will reveal someone who grew up in chaos and found different kinds of meaning in it. Someone whose leadership isn't shaped by nostalgia for order that never existed, but by pragmatic acceptance that chaos is the only reality that ever mattered. What will Judith ask when she leads? I genuinely don't know, and I don't think the show has decided yet. But I'm fairly confident it won't be Rick's 3 questions. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's necessary. Maybe that's what growth looks like in the apocalypse, each generation learning from the previous one's mistakes, keeping what worked and discarding what didn't, building something new, rather than just maintaining what was. Legacy isn't about repeating the past unchanged. It's about learning from it, extracting the wisdom while leaving behind the trauma, building something better with the materials you've been left. Rick's questions came from his trauma, but also from genuine wisdom about evaluating strangers in dangerous times. The wisdom was real. The trauma was also real. The next generation might extract the wisdom, be cautious with strangers, watch their actions more than their words, build trust slowly through demonstrated reliability while leaving behind the specific protocol born from Rick's specific grief. The 3 questions appeared 6 times across 3 seasons and then faded into memory. They were never the defining feature of Alexandria or Rick's leadership, just one tool among many, used for a while and then set aside when circumstances changed. But they reveal something important about how communities form in crisis, how trauma shapes policy, how the desperate need for controlling chaos creates rituals and protocols that feel rational, but are really just coping mechanisms, dressed up as security. And maybe understanding that, understanding where the questions came from and what they cost, maybe that's the real legacy worth preserving. Not the questions themselves, but the self-awareness to recognize when your leadership philosophy is shaped more by your trauma than by what your community actually needs. So here we are, at the end of this exploration, thinking about those 3 questions that appeared 6 times across 3 seasons and then faded like morning fog. Rick asking Clara as she died in the woods. Rick asking Sam and Anna on a supply run. Daryl and Glenn asking Bob in that pre-prison flashback. Rick asking Gabriel with suspicion and caution. Michonne asking Aaron in the car. Rick starting to ask Jesus before he ran away laughing. 6 moments where strangers had to justify their kills, articulate their philosophy, prove they understood the weight of survival in a world without mercy. 6 moments where Rick and his group try to create structure and meaning around the fundamental randomness of who lives and who dies and who gets to decide. And I keep coming back to that first instance with Clara. Rick kneeling beside her as she's dying from her self-inflicted wound, reciting the questions she asked to hear before she left. How many walkers have you killed? How many people have you killed? Why? And her answer, you don't get to come back from things. That weight, that resignation, that self-knowledge that some lines, once crossed, change you forever. That certain choices leave permanent scars on your soul that no amount of justification or time can fully heal. But the show kept trying to prove Clara wrong, didn't it? Gabriel came back from abandoning his congregation, transforming from a coward into a warrior priest. Negan came back from being a brutal tyrant, finding some measure of redemption through protecting Judith and killing Alpha and building a family with Annie. Carol came back from burning children alive at Terminus, from becoming someone who'd do absolutely anything to protect her found family. Maybe you don't get to come back to who you were, but you can become someone new. Someone who carries the weight of what you did but isn't permanently defined by it. Someone who answered Rick's 3 questions one way in Season 4 and would answer completely differently by Season 11. Rick's questions were about measuring the past, your body count, your reasons, your moral framework shaped by choices already made. But maybe the real question was always about the future. Not, why did you kill? But, will you stay? Will you build this with us? Will you become family, even though we're all carrying impossible burdens? And maybe, after all these years, after all the communities that fell and all the people who died and all the questions that were asked and answered and forgotten, maybe the answer is simply, yes. Yes, I'll stay. Yes, I'll build this with you. Yes, I'll become family even though I don't know you yet, even though you might betray me, even though nothing is guaranteed and safety is an illusion we maintain through constant vigilance and impossible luck. Not because I passed your test or answered your questions in exactly the right way, but because we're all carrying unbearable weight, and carrying it together makes it slightly more bearable. Because found family built through shared trauma and survival and stubborn refusal to give up on each other, that's the only thing that endures when everything else falls. The questions were never the point. The connection was. The willingness to risk trust despite knowing trust gets you killed. The choice to build community despite knowing communities fall. The decision to keep trying, keep hoping, keep believing that something matters beyond just breathing another day. That's what endured long after the 3 questions faded from use. That's what Judith inherited from Rick, not the specific protocol, but the deeper principle underneath it. Not interrogate strangers about violence, but build family with people who understand the weight we all carry. Maybe the real question was never about walkers or people, or why. Maybe it was simpler and harder. Will you stay? And the answer, for everyone who mattered, everyone who became family instead of just passing through, yes, despite everything, despite the cost, despite knowing it might end in loss. Yes, rest now. The questions don't matter as much as the answer.